In the Middle Ages, a woman's worth could be decided by a single sheet. After the wedding night, families sometimes demanded proof of blood, evidence that the bride had been a virgin. A red stain meant honor and security. A clean sheet could bring shame, rejection, or even violence. If you enjoy this kind of story, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now settle in and let us step back to a time when virginity was not private but public, an obsession that ruled law, family, and faith. In medieval Europe, no idea carried more weight over a woman's life than the idea of purity. Virginity was not only a personal matter but a spiritual treasure, guarded and judged by the church. Priests, theologians, and confessors spoke of it constantly, elevating virginity above all other virtues, even above marriage itself. This obsession had deep roots in Christian thought. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century, compared the virgin to a vessel untouched by corruption. Sexual acts, he warned, always carried the shadow of sin, even in lawful marriage. Thomas Aquinas repeated the same lesson centuries later. Virginity was holier than married life because it kept the body unbroken. For the church, the virgin was closer to heaven than to earth, her body an unspoiled altar. The figure of the Virgin Mary gave this belief its perfect symbol. She was mother and virgin at once, the impossible ideal. Artists painted her in robes of blue and white, while preachers held her up as the standard against which all women would be measured. A wife might be faithful, a widow honorable, but none could match the sanctity of Mary's untouched purity. These ideas spread from monasteries and universities into everyday life. Confession manuals instructed priests to ask young women about their sexual state. Was she pure? Had she been touched? Even rumors mattered. Virginity was treated not only as a fact of the body, but as a condition of the soul. To lose it outside of marriage was described as a permanent stain, impossible to wash away. This teaching shaped entire families. A daughter's virginity was guarded as if it were property, because in many ways it was. Marriage contracts, dowries, and alliances rested on the assurance of purity. A virgin bride brought honor and wealth. A bride without it could bring disgrace or financial ruin. Families protected their daughters fiercely, sometimes keeping them under near constant watch until marriage. The contradiction at the heart of this system was obvious. Marriage was praised as holy, yet always treated as second best. Virginity was lifted higher, but only as long as it remained intact. Once lost, it could never be regained. The result was an impossible standard. Women were expected to embody angelic purity until the wedding night, then to transform into fertile wives by morning. This double bind placed immense pressure on women. A slip, a rumor, even an accusation could destroy a reputation. Men, by contrast, faced no such burden. A groom's past was rarely questioned. His honor remained intact. The demand for purity was placed squarely on women's shoulders, and the church supplied the words, the rituals, and the theology to justify it. By the late Middle Ages, this obsession had hardened into law and culture. Virginity was no longer simply a moral question, but a matter of contracts, inheritances, and public honor. It was guarded in homes, tested in marriages, and preached from pulpits. The myth of purity was powerful, not because it was true, but because institutions repeated it endlessly until it shaped every part of life. For women, it was a burden they could never escape. Their worth, their future, even their salvation was bound to a fragile condition that could vanish in a single night. The church called it virtue, families called it honor. But for countless women, it was simply a chain, one that tied their bodies to expectations they could never fully control. In the Middle Ages, virginity was never just a private matter. It was a currency of reputation, carrying the weight of entire families. A daughter's purity could decide alliances, dowries, and inheritances. It could elevate a household's standing or drag it into disgrace. To guard virginity was to guard family honor, and this obsession shaped daily life from the poorest peasant village to the grandest noble court. For noble families, the stakes were enormous. Marriages were political tools, designed to link lands, secure loyalties, or strengthen dynasties. A virgin bride was a guarantee of legitimacy. The children born of the union would be recognized as true heirs, free from suspicion. Without that guarantee, an alliance might collapse before it began. Chronicles record cases where betrothals were broken on the faintest rumor of impurity. A whispered story from a servant, a hint of impropriety in a young woman as past. These could be enough to derail negotiations worth fortunes. Among peasants, the same principle applied, though on a smaller scale. A farmer's daughter without her reputation intact might struggle to find a husband at all. Her family risked shame in the community, their honor questioned at markets and church gatherings. The gossip of neighbors was relentless, and once spoken, it rarely faded. In such tightly knit villages, a young woman's perceived purity was the thin line between respectability and scorn. Families, therefore, guarded daughters fiercely. In many places, girls were not allowed to walk alone in town, especially near taverns or fairs. Brothers acted as protectors, watching for threats to their sisters' reputations. Mothers warned constantly about the dangers of dishonor. Fathers treated their daughters' virginity as part of the household's wealth, something to be preserved until it could be spent in marriage. The rituals of protection were sometimes extreme. In noble households, daughters might be kept in near seclusion, their movements carefully monitored. Some were placed in convents temporarily, a way to ensure their reputation remained untouched until marriage. In villages, girls might be married very young, not out of affection, but out of fear that waiting would bring gossip or temptation. The rush to secure a husband was less about love than about locking in honor before it could be lost. The obsession with family honor created a world of double standards. Sons were free to wander, to drink, even to visit prostitutes without consequence. Their reputations were rarely at risk. Daughters, by contrast, lived under constant scrutiny. Their words, their dress, even their laughter could be judged as signs of impropriety. A glance in the wrong place, a walk taken alone, could spark whispers that spread like wildfire. The burden extended beyond marriage. A bride's virginity was expected to be proven on the wedding night. The infamous bloodied sheet, displayed to family or neighbors, was not only about the woman, it was about the reputation of her entire kin. A red stain preserved the honor of both houses. The absence of one could disgrace them. In some regions, a bride whose purity was questioned brought shame not only to herself, but to every relative connected to her. This obsession reveals the cruelty of medieval honor culture. Women carried the weight of reputations they did not choose. Their bodies became symbols of loyalty, purity, and trustworthiness. Their mistakes, or even false accusations, were treated as crimes against their families. Virginity was not just a virtue, it was a chain, binding women to expectations enforced by parents, brothers, and husbands alike. In the end, family honor was less about love than about control. A woman's virginity became the fragile thread tying together wealth, alliances, and social survival. For the church, it was virtue. For families, it was currency. But for women themselves, it was a burden carried in silence, where one rumor or one mistake could destroy everything. It was not only a virtue or a matter of family pride, it was treated like a commodity, something with measurable value that could be traded, bought, or lost. In marriage markets across towns and villages, a daughter's purity was woven directly into negotiations, as real and as tangible as land, cattle, or coin. The dowry system made this painfully clear. A dowry was the wealth a bride brought into her marriage, money, property, or goods. Yet its value was deeply tied to her reputation. A virgin bride, seen as pure and untouched, could attract better matches and higher offers. A bride whose purity was in doubt might see her dowry raised steeply, as if to compensate for lost value. In some cases, negotiations collapsed entirely. Thus, virginity functioned as a form of currency, increasing or diminishing the economic weight of the woman and her family. Marriage contracts spelled this logic out in writing. Legal documents in Italy, France, and England sometimes included explicit references to the honor of the bride, meaning her untouched state. If later it was discovered or claimed that she had not been a virgin, families could sue, annul the marriage, or demand the return of dowries. Virginity was not only symbolic, it was enforceable in courts, treated as a breach of contract when absent. For wealthy families, this created a climate of paranoia. Daughters were watched not just for honor, but for financial security. A careless rumor could mean the loss of thousands of coins, the collapse of alliances, the ruin of entire estates. Marriage negotiations became inspections not only of wealth, but of bodies, with virginity standing as the most fragile asset of all. Among peasants, the principle was less formal, but no less real. A virgin girl might bring her family a marriage into a slightly wealthier household. A girl suspected of impurity might only find a husband among the poor, or perhaps no husband at all. Virginity shaped prospects as much as land or labor, determining whether a family rose or fell in the social order. The commodification of virginity was brutally unfair. A man's past was almost never questioned. A groom might have fathered bastards, visited brothels, or lived wildly before marriage, yet his value in negotiations remained untouched. A woman's worth, by contrast, could evaporate instantly, reduced to a number on a contract or a stain on a sheet. The result was a system that turned women's bodies into goods. A virgin was prized like fresh produce. A woman without virginity was treated as damaged stock. This dehumanizing view was repeated endlessly in sermons, laws, and daily gossip until it became accepted as natural. Women themselves sometimes internalized it, speaking of virginity as treasure or fortune, echoing the language of the marketplace. This commodification also bred cruelty. Families desperate to preserve honor sometimes forced daughters into convents if their virginity was in doubt, hoping the cloister would hide their shame. Others married daughters off hastily before gossip could spread. In darker cases, violence was used against girls suspected of dishonor, as though punishing them might restore lost value. Virginity as commodity reveals the cold logic at the heart of medieval society. What was sacred in sermons became transactional in contracts. What was holy in art became negotiable in marriage markets. The church might exalt purity as divine, but families treated it as a bargaining chip, as real and as fragile as gold. For the women themselves, this meant their bodies were never truly their own. Their purity was calculated, priced, and exchanged in ways they could not control. They lived as vessels of honor and currency, carrying wealth they could neither spend nor protect. In this sense, virginity was not just a myth or a virtue. It was a marketplace, one that reduced lives to contracts and reputations, where the stakes were nothing less than survival. Few images capture the brutality of medieval views on virginity as vividly as the bloodied sheet. For many communities, the wedding night was not a private affair but a public test, and the proof of purity had to be displayed in physical form. A simple white sheet, stained red, became the evidence on which reputations, marriages, and family honor depended. The ritual varied across regions, but the logic was the same. After the consummation of the marriage, the sheet was inspected. If blood marked the cloth, it was triumphantly shown to relatives or even to assembled neighbors. A red stain meant the bride had been pure, honor was intact, contracts secured, and celebrations could continue. But if no stain appeared, whispers began. Was the bride impure? Had the groom failed? Families searched for someone to blame, and almost always, suspicion fell on the woman. For the bride, this ritual was a nightmare. Her worth was judged not by her virtues, her kindness, or her loyalty, but by whether her body produced a physical sign on command. Yet biology is not so simple. Not every woman bleeds during first intercourse, and not every sheet carries a mark. The injustice was terrible. A woman-aw's life could be ruined by the absence of a single stain, regardless of her innocence. Accounts from medieval chronicles reveal the cruelty of this custom. In some places, the sheet was paraded through the streets, held aloft like a banner of victory. Families cheered, guests congratulated the groom, and neighbors whispered approval. But the reverse was just as dramatic. If no proof appeared, the bride could be mocked, rejected, or even sent back to her family in disgrace. The shame did not belong only to her, but spread to parents, siblings, and kin, staining them all with suspicion. The ritual turned the most intimate act into public theater. What should have been a private beginning for a couple became a test for an entire community to witness. The bedchamber was no refuge. Its sheets were evidence, its silence broken by the judgment of onlookers. The bride became an object of inspection, her body reduced to proof, her dignity stripped away. The tradition also reveals the deep hypocrisy of the age. Men, whose virginity was never tested, judged women by standards they themselves never had to meet. A groom could enter the marriage bed with experience, and no one asked for proof of his purity. Yet the bride faced an ordeal with no mercy, her entire future hinging on whether her body performed according to expectation. Families sometimes tried to prepare for the ritual with desperate measures. Mothers advised daughters to scratch their thighs with pins, or even to hide animal blood to stain the sheets if needed. Such tricks speak to the terror women felt, knowing their lives might collapse over the absence of a single drop of blood. The bloodied sheet ritual was not universal, but where it existed, it revealed the cruel intersection of sexuality, honor, and spectacle. It showed how virginity was transformed from a private condition into a public trial, a drama staged for the benefit of others. It turned marriage into theater and women into exhibits. To modern eyes, it seems barbaric. Yet in the Middle Ages, it was accepted as common sense, a natural step in securing alliances and reputations. The sheet became a symbol of society's obsession, a relic of a culture where purity was never private, and honor was always at stake. For countless brides, it was not a mere cloth, but a trap, a test impossible to escape. Beyond the bloodied sheet, medieval society devised other ways to test a woman's purity. These so-called virginity tests, carried out by midwives, matrons, or even legal officials, were attempts to turn the body into proof. They were often invasive, humiliating, and rooted in myth rather than science. Yet they carried enormous weight, determining whether a woman could marry, inherit, or even remain in her community. The most common belief centered on the hymen, imagined as a physical seal of virginity. Medieval medicine claimed that an intact hymen proved purity, while a broken one betrayed sexual activity. In reality, the hymen varies widely and may break through activities unrelated to intercourse, but such nuances were ignored. A simple inspection, sometimes ordered by families or courts, could decide a woman's fate. Midwives were called to examine brides accused of impurity, their verdicts treated as near sacred truth. These inspections were profoundly degrading. A woman was reduced to an object under scrutiny, her privacy stripped away, her honor hanging on the judgment of others. Some tests involved checking the tightness of the vaginal muscles. Others, the presence of supposed signs like the freshness of skin, or even the brightness of eyes. The body was read like a text, interpreted according to superstition rather than knowledge. Other myths went even further. Some manuals claimed that virgins urinated differently, or that they walked with a special gait. In France and Germany, there were beliefs that a true virgin could run long distances without tiring, or that she had a particular sweet smell. Such absurdities reveal less about women's bodies and more about the paranoia of the society that invented them. In court cases, these tests became decisive. If a marriage was contested, the bride might be examined publicly, her body transformed into legal evidence. Families desperate to protect their honor sometimes pressured midwives to declare their daughters untouched, regardless of truth. Others bribed or threatened examiners. Virginity was not only a condition but a verdict, handed down like a sentence, subject to manipulation and corruption. The cruelty of these tests lay in their impossibility. Virginity, once defined as a physical state, could never be proven beyond doubt. Yet women were forced into trials where their dignity was destroyed, their bodies dissected by rumor and superstition. The tests reflected a world obsessed with control, where men demanded certainty from women's bodies that nature itself could not provide. For women, the terror of these inspections was constant. A single accusation could summon examiners to her door. A jealous rival, an angry husband, or a suspicious family could all set the process in motion. Even if declared pure, the shame of exposure lingered. If judged impure, the consequences were devastating: annulled marriages, ruined reputations, or even punishments by law. To modern eyes, these tests seem grotesque, but in their time they were taken seriously. They reveal how little room women had to define their own lives. Their bodies turned into sites of interrogation and judgment. Virginity was never theirs to claim. It was something demanded, tested, and pronounced by others. In the end, these so-called virginity tests were less about truth than about power. They were rituals of control, ways for families, husbands, and institutions to dominate women under the guise of certainty. The tests did not protect virtue. They destroyed dignity. They did not reveal purity. They created fear. The medieval obsession with virginity was not only a matter of custom or ritual, it was also written into law. Across Europe, courts, councils, and local assemblies treated purity as a condition that could decide the validity of marriages, the legitimacy of children, and even the fate of inheritances. What the church preached from pulpits was reinforced in legal codes, turning virginity into a matter of record and judgment. Marriage contracts often contained implicit or explicit references to purity. A groom had the right to expect his bride to be untouched, and if he believed otherwise, he could appeal to both church and secular courts. Annulments were sometimes granted on the basis that the bride had not been a virgin. In such cases, families might be forced to return dowries, undo alliances, or pay damages. The supposed loss of virginity became grounds for legal dispute, treated with the same seriousness as theft or fraud. Court records reveal the humiliating procedures that followed such accusations. Midwives or matrons were summoned to examine the bride, their testimony submitted as evidence. Witnesses were called to report on rumors or observations. In some cases, neighbors testified about whether they had ever seen the bride alone with a man, or whether her behavior had seemed improper. Gossip and suspicion became admissible in court, their weight equal to that of physical proof. The consequences of being judged impure were severe. A marriage might be dissolved, leaving the woman disgraced and her family dishonored. She might be sent back to her parents, her future ruined. In more extreme cases, women accused of hiding their lack of virginity could be fined or punished under local law. The stigma was lifelong, following them even if they later remarried or joined a convent. These customs reflected not only religious ideals, but also economic realities. A virgin bride secured inheritance rights for her husband's children, ensuring that property passed without dispute. If a woman was not a virgin, suspicion fell on her offspring. Were they truly legitimate? Could they inherit? By tying inheritance to purity, medieval law made virginity the cornerstone of property and power. Families fought bitterly to defend their claims, using accusations of impurity as weapons in disputes over land and wealth. In some regions, civic statutes went even further. Italian city-states, for example, recorded dowry disputes in minute detail, with virginity often at the center of the argument. In France, local courts accepted annulments based on a bride's supposed lack of chastity. In England, ecclesiastical courts, operating under canon law, handled endless petitions related to virginity and marriage, blending theology with legal procedure. The persistence of these laws reveals how deeply purity was embedded in the structure of medieval society. It was not simply a private expectation, but a matter of contracts, lawsuits, and inheritance. To lose virginity outside of marriage was to risk not only shame, but legal ruin. To prove virginity was to secure not only honor, but also wealth and stability. Yet these laws were never neutral. They overwhelmingly favored men, granting them the power to accuse, test, and discard women. A groom could claim his wife had deceived him and seek annulment. A woman could rarely claim the same against her husband. The imbalance was stark. Men's reputations survived scandal, women's did not. In the end, virginity in law and custom reveals the cold machinery behind the myth. What priests called holy, courts turned into contracts. What families treated as honor, judges treated as evidence. Women's bodies became sites of legal scrutiny, their worth measured in bloodstains, rumors, and testimonies. The law did not protect them, it bound them. It gave authority to suspicion and permanence to shame. In the Middle Ages, the loss of virginity outside of marriage was more than a personal matter. It was a crime against honor, family, and community. For women, the punishments could be swift, cruel, and lifelong. The absence of purity marked them as defective, and society treated them accordingly. One of the most common punishments was rejection. A groom who discovered or believed that his bride was not a virgin could repudiate her on the spot. Annulments were granted, contracts dissolved, dowries reclaimed. Families, once eager to celebrate, might send the young woman back in disgrace, her reputation destroyed. She was often left unmarriageable, her prospects collapsed forever. Public humiliation was another weapon. Communities sometimes staged shaming rituals for women accused of impurity. They might be paraded through the streets, forced to wear mocking symbols, or displayed at the doors of churches. In some German towns, women were dressed in rags and placed on donkeys, led in front of neighbors who jeered. The message was clear. Impurity was not private. It was a spectacle of dishonor. Economic punishments also played a role. Families could be fined if their daughter's virginity was found lacking after marriage, as though they had sold defective goods. In such cases, the bride herself bore the stigma, but her relatives suffered the financial consequences. Virginity was tied so tightly to contracts that its loss carried penalties measured in coin as well as in shame. In more extreme cases, punishment turned violent. Chronicles tell of women beaten, disowned, or even killed by families who felt dishonored. In some regions, honor killings were justified as a way to cleanse the family name. While not universal, such acts reveal how deadly the obsession with purity could become. The burden of restoring reputation fell on women's bodies, sometimes at the cost of their lives. The hypocrisy of these punishments was glaring. Men faced no such scrutiny. A groom could enter marriage with a long history of sexual experience, and no one demanded proof of his purity. If a man strayed after marriage, it was often tolerated or ignored. But for women, a single slip, or even the suspicion of one, was enough to ruin everything. The double standard was not hidden. It was embraced as natural, written into custom and law. For many women, the only escape from disgrace was the convent. Families sometimes placed daughters accused of impurity in monasteries, where vows of chastity covered past sins. Yet even this path was often more prison than refuge. Women entered not from devotion, but from desperation, their futures cut short by accusations they could not disprove. The punishments reveal the cruelty of a society that treated virginity not as a personal choice, but as a public contract. To lose it outside of marriage was to violate an agreement no woman had freely signed, and yet the consequences were hers alone to bear. Her body became the battlefield on which family honor, community standards, and patriarchal control were fought. To modern readers, these punishments may seem disproportionate, even barbaric. But to the medieval mind, they were logical. Virginity was tied to trust, inheritance, and divine will. To break it was to fracture the fragile order of society. The severity of the response was not only about the woman herself, but about the collective fear of disorder, shame, and dishonor spreading through the community. In the end, the punishments for non-virgins show the darker side of medieval life, where virtue was less about morality than about control. Women lived under the constant threat of exposure, rejection, and violence, their lives balanced on the fragile thread of a reputation they could not always protect. Virginity was praised as virtue, but its loss brought consequences as harsh as any crime. In the medieval imagination, the line between lost virginity and adultery was often blurred. Both were framed as betrayals, one of the family, the other of the marriage bond. And in both cases, the burden fell almost entirely on women. A woman who entered marriage without virginity was seen as deceptive. A wife accused of adultery was treated as a criminal. The language of sin and dishonor tied the two together, making purity not just a condition at marriage, but a lifelong expectation. Adultery was condemned in law, religion, and custom, but its enforcement was profoundly unequal. For men, dalliances with prostitutes, servants, or even neighbors were often tolerated. Priests preached against such behavior, yet society rarely punished men with the same force it used against women. A husband's reputation might remain intact, even if his affairs were well known. But for women, even the suspicion of adultery was enough to bring disgrace, punishment, and sometimes death. Accusations were common. A woman who failed to conceive could be accused of unfaithfulness, the absence of children interpreted as proof that she had sought another man. Jealous neighbors or rivals spread rumors, and husbands used charges of adultery to control or discard wives. Trials often followed, with humiliating interrogations or public punishments. In some cases, women were forced to swear oaths of innocence before the entire community, their reputations laid bare in front of all. The penalties varied. In many towns, women accused of adultery were fined heavily or flogged in public. Others were paraded through the streets with shorn hair or mocking clothing, symbols of their shame. In harsher cases, particularly where honor killings were common, adulterous women could be executed, stoned, drowned, or burned. The brutality was justified as cleansing, an act to restore the moral order. The connection to virginity lay in the expectation that a woman's sexuality belonged to others. Before marriage, her virginity belonged to her family, proof of honor and legitimacy. After marriage, her fidelity belonged to her husband, a guarantee of inheritance and loyalty. At no point was her sexuality truly her own. Adultery was therefore treated as a continuation of the same betrayal, the misuse of a body that society claimed to own. The hypocrisy was glaring. Men could visit brothels without fear, their behavior excused as natural weakness. Women in prostitution were condemned, yet the men who sustained the trade were rarely punished. A wife, meanwhile, lived under surveillance. Her words, movements, and friendships could all be scrutinized. A glance at another man, a conversation in private, might be twisted into evidence of betrayal. Literature of the time reflected this double standard. Ballads, poems, and morality tales depicted women as temptresses, their unfaithfulness leading men to ruin. Adulterous wives were mocked, shamed, or punished in stories, serving as warnings to audiences. Men, however, were celebrated for their conquests, their infidelities treated as comic or heroic adventures. The contrast was not subtle. It was an accepted truth of the culture. The shadow of virginity lingered even here. A wife who had entered marriage already impure was seen as more likely to betray her husband later. Purity was imagined as a lifelong shield, its absence a sign of inevitable corruption. Thus, women without virginity bore suspicion long after the wedding night, their reputations fragile, their loyalty doubted. In this way, virginity and adultery were two sides of the same coin. Both reduced women to objects of trust, their value measured by their obedience to a system that forgave men and condemned them. The price of deviation was humiliation, punishment, or death. For countless women, marriage did not end the scrutiny of purity. It only extended it, binding their lives to expectations they could never escape. For medieval women, the loss of virginity was not only judged on the wedding night or in cases of adultery. Even those who followed the rules, marrying faithfully and living within the bounds of church law, could find themselves marked by suspicion if their circumstances changed. Widows and divorced women carried a permanent stigma. No matter how honorable their lives, they were defined not as individuals, but as women without virginity, and in a society obsessed with purity, that absence mattered more than anything else. Widows occupied an uneasy place. On the one hand, the church praised them for remaining chaste after their husbands' deaths. Manuals of confession advised widows to avoid remarriage if possible, arguing that a second union was a sign of weakness. Virginity was held as the ideal, but since it could not be regained, chastity after widowhood was the next best thing. A widow who devoted herself to prayer and service might be admired. Yet a widow who sought remarriage was often whispered about, suspected of lust, and treated as if her desire were shameful. Economically, widows also faced challenges. Their ability to remarry was limited not only by finances but by reputation. Men sought virgins for brides, women who could guarantee honor and legitimate heirs. A widow, even if wealthy, carried the shadow of experience. Her sexuality was no longer seen as pure, and so her value in the marriage market diminished. In some cases, her dowry was smaller, her negotiations harder. The very fact that she had been a wife before placed her in a lesser category. Divorced women fared even worse. Though divorce was rare in the Middle Ages, annulments and separations did occur, usually at the insistence of husbands. Women cast aside in this way bore the mark of rejection. They were often accused of impurity or disobedience, their reputations destroyed by legal rulings that branded them unworthy. Few men were willing to marry a woman already set aside once. To do so was to invite suspicion or ridicule. In literature and popular culture, widows and divorced women were easy targets for satire. Plays and poems mocked them as lustful, desperate, or deceitful. They were depicted as predators on young men or as schemers seeking wealth through remarriage. Such stereotypes reinforced the idea that a woman without virginity was inherently dangerous, her desires uncontrolled, her presence destabilizing. Even within their own communities, widows could face marginalization. Some were denied positions of influence, excluded from guilds, or restricted in property rights. Others found themselves pressured to join convents, where a vow of perpetual chastity erased the problem of their sexuality. For many, this was less a choice than an escape from the suspicion that haunted them in public life. The cruel irony is that these women had often done nothing wrong. They had married as expected, borne children, served their households, and followed the laws of church and community. Yet, once their circumstances changed, they were reclassified as suspects simply because they were no longer virgins. Virginity, once lost, even in marriage, remained an absence that defined them for life. The stigma of widows and divorced women shows how deeply the myth of purity penetrated medieval society. Virginity was not simply a moment in time, it was imagined as a lifelong condition, and its absence marked women permanently. No matter how faithfully they lived, no matter how devout their prayers or generous their service, they could never reclaim the status they had lost. In this way, widowhood and divorce became silent punishments. Women carried the weight of suspicion, their worth diminished by a standard they could never meet again. Virginity was praised as virtue, but its loss, whether through marriage, widowhood, or separation, left women in the shadows, bound to reputations they could never escape. In medieval Europe, the Church did not simply praise virginity, it sanctified it. The highest models of purity were not wives or mothers, but the so-called virgin martyrs, young women who, according to legend, chose death rather than surrender their chastity. Their stories filled sermons, stained glass windows, and devotional books. For centuries, these tales shaped how women imagined their own worth, holding up a terrifying example. It was better to die violently than to lose virginity outside God's will. Saint Agnes was perhaps the most famous. Barely 13, she was said to have rejected the advances of a powerful Roman official, declaring that Christ was her only bridegroom. When threatened with rape, she prayed, and her hair miraculously grew long enough to cover her body. She was eventually executed, remembered not for her life but for her refusal to yield her purity. Other saints followed the same pattern: Saint Cecilia, Saint Lucy, Saint Agatha, each presented as holy because she had resisted desire, endured torture, and embraced death with her virginity intact. These stories were gruesome. Some martyrs were burned, others beheaded, others mutilated. The details were repeated in sermons with chilling relish, designed to inspire awe. The moral was clear: a virgin who resisted was a saint, a woman who yielded was a sinner. The Church used these tales to create a stark divide, elevating women who suffered and died while casting suspicion on those who lived ordinary lives. The cult of virgin martyrs spread far beyond the pulpit. Their relics were treasured, their feast days celebrated with great ceremony. Pilgrims visited shrines dedicated to them, praying for intercession, particularly for protection of young girls. Families named daughters after them, hoping to imprint purity into their very identities. Virginity became not only a personal expectation but a spiritual destiny, sanctified through the example of death. For ordinary women, these ideals were both inspiring and crushing. To be compared to a martyr was an honor, but it was also a demand. The stories implied that a true Christian woman should guard her purity even at the cost of her life. A peasant girl, assaulted by a master or threatened by soldiers, was measured against saints who died rather than yield. The cruelty of such comparisons cannot be overstated. Women already burdened by honor codes now bore the weight of sainthood, asked to embody impossible ideals. The virgin martyrs also reinforced the double standard. Male saints were celebrated for preaching, charity, or miracles. Female saints were remembered above all for their chastity. Their holiness was tied less to what they did and more to what they refused. Virginity defined their worth in life and in death, shaping an image of womanhood that excluded those who did not or could not match it. Even art reflected this obsession. Paintings showed the martyrs serene, their wounds secondary to their purity. They were dressed in white robes, holding lilies or palms, symbols of chastity and triumph. The violence of their deaths was softened, their suffering presented as noble sacrifice. Yet the message was unmistakable. Purity was worth more than life itself. By spreading these stories, the Church bound women more tightly to the myth of virginity. It taught them that their highest calling was not marriage, motherhood, or work, but the preservation of purity at all costs. Even when impossible, even when unjust, the demand was absolute. The cult of virgin martyrs reveals how religion turned purity into both worship and weapon. It exalted women who embodied chastity, but in doing so, it condemned those who could not. For every saint celebrated, countless women were shamed, punished, or silenced for failing to meet the same impossible standard. While the Church exalted virginity as divine, the common people surrounded it with a web of magic and superstition. In villages, towns, and even noble courts, people believed purity could be guarded, restored, or revealed through charms, rituals, and strange remedies. These practices mixed folk tradition with fear, turning virginity into a field where religion and superstition clashed and blended. One of the most common superstitions involved protective amulets. Mothers gave daughters charms made of herbs, bones, or carved symbols, meant to ward off lust or prevent assault. Some wore small crosses blessed by priests, believing these would preserve their purity. Others relied on more peculiar objects: wolf teeth, iron rings, or pieces of coral, each thought to shield the body from violation. The belief was simple: virginity was fragile, and supernatural help was needed to keep it intact. There were also rituals designed to test purity. Some claimed that a virgin's urine was clearer than that of other women, or that she could walk across hot coals unharmed. Others believed that if a virgin held certain herbs, such as rue or sage, they would stay fresh longer in her hands. These tests, though absurd, were taken seriously in some communities, used as ways to prove or disprove a woman's chastity when honor was at stake. Superstitions also offered false promises of restoration. Recipes circulated for potions or ointments said to restore virginity. They might involve mixtures of vinegar, herbs, or animal parts, applied to the body in secret. Some involved ritual baths or prayers whispered at midnight. The very existence of such remedies shows the desperation of women trapped by the system. If purity could not be proven, perhaps it could be faked. At the same time, virginity was linked to magical powers. Folklore claimed that virgins could cure disease by touching the sick, that they could repel demons, or even that their prayers had special force. In some regions, virgin girls were asked to lead certain rituals, their untouched state thought to make them closer to the divine. These beliefs elevated purity, while also reinforcing the idea that virginity was not simply personal, but supernatural, a condition that carried power beyond the body. Yet superstition could also turn dangerous. Women accused of impurity sometimes faced charges of witchcraft. If a woman was not a virgin when she was expected to be, whispers might grow that she had been corrupted by sorcery. In times of panic, virginity and witchcraft became twisted together, both framed as matters of invisible proof and public fear. A woman who failed one expectation could be accused of another crime. For ordinary women, these magical beliefs were both comfort and curse. A charm might feel like protection, a ritual like reassurance, but none of it could shield them from the scrutiny of family, church, or community. Amulets could not stop rumors, and potions could not erase shame. The very existence of these practices shows how little power women had over their own reputations, forced to turn to desperate measures in a world that demanded the impossible. The Church condemned many of these superstitions, yet it fueled the very fears that produced them. By preaching virginity as absolute, it created the pressure that drove people to seek magical shortcuts. The result was a culture where purity was not only a virtue, but a mystery, surrounded by charms, rituals, and whispered promises. In the end, these superstitions reveal how deeply the obsession with virginity ran. It was not confined to sermons or laws, but spread into kitchens, markets, and bedrooms. It shaped not only how women were judged, but how they tried to survive, clinging to herbs, charms, and prayers in the hope of protecting a reputation that was never fully theirs to control. At the heart of medieval Christianity stood the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, and the eternal model of purity. For more than 1,000 years, her image shaped how women were viewed, judged, and controlled. She was the paradox the Church offered to every daughter and wife, at once a mother and yet forever a virgin, fertile and yet untouched, holy and yet human. Her cult spread through every corner of Europe, from cathedral altars to roadside shrines, and its influence over women's lives was immense. Mary's purity was celebrated in art and liturgy. Painters depicted her draped in robes of blue and white, colors symbolizing chastity and heaven. Sculptors carved her with serene expressions, holding the infant Jesus yet untouched by sin. Hymns and prayers praised her as the Virgo intacta, the Virgin untouched, the perfect vessel for divine grace. Each repetition reinforced the message. Virginity was not just desirable, it was divine. For women, this created an impossible standard. Mary's virginity was miraculous, unique, beyond human capacity. Yet preachers urged women to imitate her, to model their lives on her purity. A peasant girl in a village, a noblewoman in a castle, a widow in a convent, all were measured against an ideal they could never reach. Even when women married and bore children, they were reminded that Mary had done so without ever losing her virginity. Their lives, by comparison, seemed lesser, tainted. The cult of Mary also deepened the Church's suspicion of female sexuality. If the holiest woman in history was defined by her untouched state, then ordinary women's desires were framed as weaknesses, reminders of humanity's fall. Virginity became not just a virtue, but the measure of holiness itself. Marriage, though praised as honorable, was always presented as second best, a concession to human weakness rather than a path to sanctity. This had concrete consequences. Girls were pressured into early marriages to secure their purity. Widows were discouraged from remarrying, told that Mary was their model of perpetual chastity. Women who entered convents were praised as brides of Christ, echoing Mary's untouched state. In every case, the cult of Mary reinforced the message that a woman's highest calling was not love, partnership, or family, but the preservation of purity. The contradiction was cruel. Mary's life was a miracle, one that could never be repeated. Yet medieval society held all women to her impossible example. The result was constant guilt, shame, and failure. Women who could not live up to her purity were reminded of their shortcomings in sermons, art, and rituals. The cult inspired devotion, but it also created despair. At the same time, Mary's cult gave men power. Priests, fathers, and husbands invoked her name to enforce control. A girl accused of impurity could be reminded of Mary's perfection. A wife suspected of infidelity could be compared to the Virgin's obedience. Even widows were judged by how closely they imitated Mary's supposed refusal to take another husband. What began as veneration became a tool of discipline, binding women to ideals that denied their humanity. And yet, for many women, Mary was also a source of comfort. She was seen as compassionate, merciful, a mother who interceded for sinners. Prayers to her filled books of hours, whispered by women seeking relief from guilt or fear. In this way, Mary was both blessing and burden, an object of devotion and an impossible standard all at once. The cult of Mary reveals the paradox of medieval virginity. It was exalted as sacred, yet used to control. It lifted women up in theory, but pressed them down in practice. It promised holiness, but delivered chains. For centuries, Mary's purity haunted every household and every heart, shaping how women were seen and how they saw themselves. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the rigid obsession with virginity began to shift. Europe was changing. Cities grew, universities flourished, trade expanded, and with it came new ways of thinking. The humanist movement, with its emphasis on classical learning and individual dignity, challenged some of the Church's harshest dogmas. Virginity, while still valued, slowly lost its position as the absolute measure of a woman's worth. Writers of the Renaissance questioned the extremes of medieval purity culture. Humanist scholars, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman texts, praised marriage and partnership more openly. They pointed to the naturalness of desire and the dignity of family life. Some argued that to exalt virginity above all else was to deny the basic humanity of women, reducing them to symbols rather than people. The old sermons declaring marriage a second-best choice began to sound less convincing in a world eager for renewal. Law and custom also evolved. While annulments and virginity trials still occurred, courts increasingly recognized that dowries, contracts, and inheritance mattered more than questions of chastity. Wealth, status, and political alliances began to outweigh the demand for proof of purity. In Italian city-states, for example, dowry disputes were still fierce, but families with enough money could often silence rumors of impurity. In a society driven more by commerce and diplomacy, virginity lost some of its power as currency. Art reflected this change. Renaissance painters still portrayed the Virgin Mary as pure, but they also filled canvases with images of worldly women, Venus, goddesses, and noble patrons, celebrated for their beauty, wealth, and intellect. Female figures were admired not only for chastity, but for charm, wit, and presence. The cult of purity did not disappear, but it was joined by new ideals that gave women, at least in representation, more than one path to recognition. The Reformation further eroded the medieval obsession. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther attacked the idea that virginity was superior to marriage. They argued that family life was the proper Christian calling and that chastity was not inherently holier than conjugal love. While this shift did not eliminate double standards, it undermined the absolute supremacy of virginity as the pinnacle of female virtue. In Protestant regions, marriage was praised as the norm, not the compromise. Yet the decline of virginity's dominance was uneven. In Catholic lands, the cult of Mary and the Virgin Martyrs remained strong. Sermons continued to exalt purity, and convents still flourished. Even where humanist and reformist ideas spread, old expectations lingered. Families continued to guard daughters closely, and reputations could still be ruined by suspicion. The myth of purity had been too deeply ingrained to vanish overnight. Still, cracks were showing. Writers, poets, and even some clerics began to satirize the bloodied sheet tradition, mocking its absurdity. Stories circulated of brides who tricked families with staged stains or of grooms too embarrassed to confess their own failings. Such humor, though cruel, revealed a growing skepticism. What had once been sacred ritual began to look, in some circles, like superstition and folly. By the 16th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. The Renaissance did not free women from the burdens of virginity, but it shifted the balance. Purity was still prized, but wealth, status, and beauty began to compete with it as measures of value. For the first time in centuries, the idea that virginity was the cornerstone of honor started to weaken. The decline was not liberation, it was transition. Women still carried heavy burdens, still judged by standards they did not choose. But the Renaissance planted seeds of change, opening the door to a world where purity, though still demanded, was no longer the only path to dignity. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the obsession with virginity did not disappear. It transformed. What had once been enforced through law, ritual, and punishment was reimagined in literature, poetry, and art. Virginity shifted from a brutal test of honor into a romantic ideal, something praised in sonnets and celebrated in stories of courtly love. The same purity that had chained women with shame was now dressed in the softer language of devotion and longing. Courtly love, the poetic tradition that flourished among knights and troubadours, played a key role in this transformation. Poets sang of pure maidens whose beauty and innocence inspired noble deeds. A knight might dedicate his victories to a lady untouched, whose virtue gave him strength. Virginity, once treated as commodity and contract, became an object of worship in verse, raising women onto pedestals of unattainable perfection. Writers such as Petrarch and later Renaissance poets described women with imagery drawn from both religion and romance. A pure maiden was likened to a shining star, a spotless rose, or a flawless jewel. Her untouched state was no longer only proof of honor, but the source of an almost mystical allure. Virginity became less about family reputation and more about poetic inspiration, transforming women into symbols of idealized love. This romanticization, however, carried its own form of control. To be adored as a pure muse was still to be confined to an ideal that denied real humanity. The maiden in poems was not a person with desires and flaws. She was an image of perfection, distant and untouchable. The pedestal was only another prison, gilded with admiration instead of chains. At the same time, visual art reinforced this new image. Renaissance painters portrayed virginal figures with luminous skin, soft expressions, and halos of light. Even secular portraits borrowed this aesthetic, presenting noble women as chaste and serene, draped in white or pale blue to signal purity. The Virgin Mary remained the supreme model, but now her aura spread into secular ideals, shaping how all women were imagined. The contradiction deepened. Society moved away from the crude humiliations of the bloodied sheet, yet women were still judged by purity, only now through ideals of beauty and poetry. Virginity was no longer tested with cloths or midwives, but with reputation, appearance, and the praise of men who adored women more as symbols than as partners. This romanticization also influenced the way marriage was viewed. Stories of tragic heroines, such as Shakespeare's Juliet or later literary figures, revolved around the fragile balance of love, purity, and honor. Virginity was not merely a physical state, but a dramatic theme used to heighten tension and emotion. The idea that a maiden's purity held immense value endured, only now framed in the language of destiny and passion. For women, the shift offered little relief. Though the punishments of the past grew less severe in some regions, the expectation remained. A young woman was still praised for her purity, still judged harshly if she strayed. The difference was that the language of devotion made the burden seem less cruel, masking old chains with new words. In this way, the medieval obsession survived, reshaped for new times. Virginity ceased to be only a legal contract or a family's fragile honor. It became a romantic dream, a poetic fantasy, a symbol woven into the very fabric of love itself. The form had changed, but the weight remained, binding women to ideals that praised them not for who they were, but for what they represented. The story of virginity in the Middle Ages is not only about purity, but about power, fear, and control. For centuries, a woman's worth was measured by a fragile condition she could not fully protect. Families guarded it, priests preached about it, laws enforced it, and communities judged it. A single sheet, a rumor, or a test could decide her fate. To remain untouched was virtue, to lose it was disgrace, and so countless women lived in the shadow of an expectation that was both impossible and merciless. Over time, the obsession shifted. The brutal trials of bloodied sheets and humiliating inspections gave way to softer ideals, clothed in the language of poetry and romance. Virginity was no longer always paraded in public squares, but it remained a standard, woven into stories of courtly love, painted into images of serene Madonnas, whispered into family negotiations. What had once been enforced by shame was now gilded by admiration. Yet beneath the change, the burden stayed the same. For widows and divorced women, the stigma lingered. For wives accused of adultery, the punishments endured. And for the young, the impossible model of the Virgin Mary cast its shadow over every prayer and every expectation. Whether through law, superstition, or devotion, women were asked to embody an ideal that denied them the fullness of their humanity. Virginity was praised as sacred, but it chained them to roles they had not chosen. As centuries passed, these chains loosened. Humanism, reform, and new ways of thinking questioned the cruelty of the old systems. Virginity began to lose its absolute hold. And yet, even in its decline, it left a legacy. The notion that a woman's worth could be tied to her sexual history did not vanish. It transformed, surviving in new forms of judgment and double standards. The medieval past lingers in the present, in whispers, in expectations, in the quiet pressure still felt by many. To imagine the lives of those women is to enter a world both distant and uncomfortably familiar. Picture the chamber where a young bride waits, terrified of what will be found on the sheets. Picture the widow, devout and dignified, yet spoken of as if she were dangerous. Picture the girl who wears a charm around her neck, hoping a herb or a prayer will protect her from suspicion. These lives were real, fragile, and shaped by a culture that made purity their prison. Now, as the story fades and the lights dim, we are left with the silence of empty chambers and folded linens, the voices of preachers long gone, the shadows of rituals now abandoned. The blood on the sheets has dried. The court records have yellowed. The relics of saints rest in quiet shrines. What remains is the echo of an obsession, a reminder of how fear can shape lives and how ideals can wound as much as they inspire. May this reflection drift into stillness, a gentle reminder of the strange burdens of the past. Rest now, knowing that the world of medieval virginity, with all its cruelty and contradictions, belongs to history. Let the voices fade, the torches dim, and the story settle into silence. Sleep, as countless women once longed to, free at last from the weight of purity's chains.